I trusted my sons with my life. I thought blood meant loyalty. I was so wrong it nearly destroyed me. But the moment of pure shock was when I heard, "Just sign here, Mom. It's for your own good." My hands were shaking as I held that pen. Something deep in my gut told me not to sign, but these were my own sons standing in my living room, looking so concerned and caring. How could I not trust them? They had no idea I would eventually discover what those papers really meant. And they definitely had no idea what I was going to do about it. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened to me could happen to any grandmother in America, and I need you to hear this story. I'm here in my beautiful sunroom at Mountain View Haven, looking out at the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, and I have to share this because too many elderly women are being robbed blind by the very people who are supposed to protect them. My name is Constance Elizabeth Hartwell. Most folks call me Connie, and I'm 76 years old now. For 38 years, I taught 3rd grade at Grove Park Elementary here in Asheville. I believed in education, I believed in family, and I believed that if you sacrificed everything for the people you loved, they'd be there for you when you needed them most. I was wrong about that last part. For more than a decade, I turned my home into a care facility. My husband, Harold, had suffered a massive stroke in 2005, and my elderly in-laws needed constant supervision. While other women my age were enjoying retirement, traveling, or pursuing hobbies, I was changing adult diapers, administering medications 4 times a day, and sleeping in 2-hour shifts to monitor 3 different people who couldn't be left alone. My sons, Robert, the insurance salesman, and Thomas, who works in banking, would stop by occasionally. "Mom, you're amazing," they'd always say. "We don't know how you do it." But they never offered to help. They never offered to hire assistants. They just praised my dedication and went back to their busy lives. When Harold's father died in 2017, followed by his mother 6 months later, I thought maybe I could finally rest. But Harold's condition had worsened over the years. By 2020, he needed round-the-clock care, and I was 67 years old, exhausted, and developing my own health problems from the constant stress. That's when Harold had his final stroke and died in our bedroom on a cold February morning. I'd spent 46 years married to that man, 15 of those years as his caregiver. The house felt enormous and empty without him, but it was filled with 46 years of memories. It was where we'd raised our boys, where we'd hosted family Christmas dinners, where Harold had built me a garden workshop so I could pursue my love of pottery. It was home. Tell me in the comments what you're doing right now while you listen to my story. Are you having your morning coffee, folding laundry, or maybe taking a quiet moment for yourself? Hit that like button because each like is so important to help my voice reach other women who need to hear this. And subscribe to Grandma's Legacy because no woman should ever feel alone in her struggles. 6 months after Harold's funeral, my sons started visiting more frequently. They'd sit in my living room, looking around with expressions I couldn't quite read at the time. Now I know they were calculating. "Mom, this house is getting too big for you," Robert would say. "All these stairs, all this maintenance. Are you sure you can handle it?" "Mom, we worry about you being here alone," Thomas would add. "What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency? We live 20 minutes away. What if we can't get here in time?" I appreciated their concern. I really did. After years of them being too busy to help with Harold or their grandparents, it felt good to have my sons paying attention to me again. That was my first mistake. But the real mistake, the one that would cost me everything, was trusting them when they said those papers were just to make things easier. Let me paint you a picture of what my life looked like before everything fell apart, because I want you to understand exactly what I lost when my own sons decided to steal my entire world. The house on Magnolia Street had been our dream home when Harold and I bought it in 1978. It was a beautiful craftsman bungalow with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, and the most gorgeous wraparound porch you've ever seen. Harold was working as a mechanic at the Ford dealership then, and I was teaching elementary school. Together, we made just enough to afford the mortgage payments, But it was tight those first few years. We painted every room ourselves, refinished the hardwood floors on our hands and knees, and planted the oak tree in the front yard that's now tall enough to shade the entire house. Harold built me raised garden beds in the backyard where I grew tomatoes, peppers, and herbs every summer. He also converted the basement into a workshop where he restored old furniture as a hobby. This wasn't just a house, it was the center of our family's universe. Robert and Thomas grew up in that house. I can still see them sliding down the banister of the front stairs, playing catch in the backyard, and helping Harold with his furniture projects in the basement. When they graduated high school, both boys went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and Harold and I were so proud. We took out a home equity loan to help with their college expenses because we wanted them to start their adult lives without crushing debt. When Robert married Susan in 1995, we hosted their engagement party on our back patio. When Thomas married Linda in 1998, we did the same thing. Both weddings were held at the country club, paid for partly with money we'd saved by taking second jobs. Harold worked nights at a gas station, and I tutored students after school. But our real joy came when the grandchildren started arriving. Robert and Susan had twins, Madison and Mason, in 1999. Thomas and Linda had Jessica in 2001, followed by Brandon in 2003. I was the grandmother who showed up to every soccer game, every school play, every birthday party. I was the one who kept them during summer vacations when their parents wanted to travel. I was the one who taught them to bake cookies, helped with homework, and read bedtime stories when they stayed overnight. I was also the one who started putting money aside for their college educations. Harold and I had grown up poor, him in rural Kentucky, me in a small town outside Charlotte. Neither of us had been able to go to college because our families couldn't afford it. We were determined that our grandchildren would have opportunities we'd never had. Starting when each child was born, I began setting aside $50 a month from my teaching salary. When Harold's furniture restoration hobby started bringing in some extra money, we increased it to $100 per child per month. When I got my master's degree and my teaching salary increased, we bumped it up again. By the time Madison and Mason graduated high school in 2017, I had saved $28,000 for each of them. For Jessica and Brandon, who graduated in 2019 and 2021 respectively, I had managed to save even more, $35,000 each. But that wasn't enough to cover 4 college educations, especially with the cost of tuition rising every year. So I started making what I thought were smart financial decisions for my grandchildren's futures. I sold my grandmother's antique jewelry collection for $15,000 and put it toward Madison's tuition at NC State. I cashed in a small retirement account early, paying hefty penalties to help with Mason's expenses at Appalachian State University. When Jessica decided she wanted to go to Duke University, a private school with tuition costs of over $50,000 a year, I took out a second mortgage on the house. Harold was already showing signs of cognitive decline from his stroke, so I handled all the financial decisions myself. I was 64 years old, still working full-time, and I signed papers for a $40,000 loan against our home to help pay for Jessica's dream education. For Brandon, who wanted to study engineering at NC State, I liquidated Harold's entire 401k retirement account. After taxes and penalties, it gave us $45,000, which combined with what I'd saved was enough to get him through 4 years without student loans. By the time all 4 grandchildren had graduated college, I had spent a total of $180,000 on their educations. Some of it came from savings, some from Harold's retirement, some from selling family heirlooms, and some from loans against our house. But I was proud of those kids. Madison became a nurse. Mason went into computer programming, Jessica got her degree in business administration, and Brandon became an engineer just like he'd planned. Not one of them graduated with student loan debt. Not one of them ever said thank you. In fact, after their graduation parties, which I also helped pay for, the grandchildren gradually stopped visiting. Madison and Mason moved to Charlotte and rarely called. Jessica got married and moved to Virginia without even inviting me to the wedding. Brandon took a job in Raleigh and acted like I didn't exist. By 2018, when Harold's health was deteriorating rapidly and I was spending every waking moment taking care of him and his parents, those grandchildren I'd sacrificed everything for had essentially disappeared from my life. But I told myself it was normal. Young people are busy building their own lives, I reasoned. They'd remember their grandmother's love eventually. I was wrong about that too. Harold's parents, Margaret and Frank Hartwell, had moved in with us in 2005, the same year Harold had his first stroke. They were both in their early 80s and developing dementia. Their own house had become dangerous. Frank had started leaving the stove on, and Margaret had wandered out of the house twice and gotten lost in the neighborhood. "Mom, you're the only one who can handle this," Robert had said when we were discussing what to do with his grandparents. "You're a teacher. You know how to be patient with people who need extra help. Besides," Thomas had added, "it would be so expensive to put them in a nursing home. This way, we can keep the family together." So for over a decade, I cared for 3 people simultaneously. I administered Harold's stroke medications, monitored Margaret's blood pressure, helped Frank with his insulin injections for diabetes, and made sure all 3 of them ate proper meals, took their pills on time, and stayed safe. I converted our dining room into a bedroom for Margaret and Frank so they wouldn't have to navigate stairs. I installed grab bars in both bathrooms, bought a hospital bed for Harold, and learned how to operate a dozen different medical devices. Every day was the same routine: wake up at 6 a.m., check on everyone, dispense morning medications, prepare breakfast, help with bathing and dressing, monitor afternoon naps, prepare lunch, manage evening medications, cook dinner, and then stay awake half the night making sure no one fell trying to get to the bathroom. I was exhausted constantly, but I told myself this was what families did for each other. This was love in action. My sons would visit on weekends sometimes, usually for an hour or 2. They'd praise my dedication, tell me how wonderful I was, and then leave to go back to their normal lives. Neither of them ever offered to take a shift caring for their father or grandparents. Neither of them ever offered to hire professional help to give me a break. When I'd hint that I was getting overwhelmed, they'd say things like, "Mom, you're so much better at this than we could ever be. They need you." What I didn't realize then was that they were already planning how to benefit financially from my sacrifices. After Margaret died in 2017, followed by Frank 6 months later, and then Harold in 2020, I was finally alone in that house for the first time in over a decade. I was 67 years old, exhausted, grieving, and surrounded by 46 years of memories. I was also sitting on the most valuable asset I'd ever owned, a house that had appreciated significantly in value over the decades. That's when my sons started paying very close attention to me again. And that's when they began planning the most devastating betrayal of my entire life. The first hint that something was wrong came during what I thought was a routine family dinner in September 2020, about 7 months after Harold's death. Robert and Thomas had started visiting every Sunday, which I initially saw as a blessing. After years of feeling isolated while caring for Harold and his parents, I was grateful to have my sons back in my life. They'd bring their wives occasionally, and we'd sit around the kitchen table sharing meals and catching up on family news. But looking back now, I can see they weren't there to comfort their grieving mother. They were there to conduct surveillance. "Mom, have you thought about what you want to do with Dad's tools?" Robert asked one Sunday, gesturing toward the basement workshop. "There's some pretty valuable equipment down there." "And all those restored furniture pieces," Thomas added. "Dad put a lot of work into those antiques. They might be worth quite a bit." I wasn't ready to think about disposing of Harold's belongings. Everything in that basement workshop held memories. The workbench where he'd taught Robert and Thomas to use hand tools, the antique rocking chair he'd restored for Jessica's nursery, the collection of vintage woodworking planes he'd accumulated over 30 years. "I'm not ready to deal with that yet," I told them. "Maybe in a year or 2, when the grief isn't so fresh." They exchanged a look that I didn't understand at the time. Now I know they were calculating how much money they were leaving on the table by waiting for me to be emotionally ready. Over the next few months, their visits became more focused on practical matters. They'd walk through the house pointing out maintenance issues that needed attention. They'd comment on how much work it must be to keep up such a large property. They'd mention elderly neighbors who'd moved to retirement communities and seemed so much happier. Mrs. Henderson down the street moved to that nice place out on Hendersonville Road, Susan mentioned one afternoon. She says it's wonderful not having to worry about yard work and home repairs anymore. And think about the liability, Mom, Linda added. If someone slips on your front steps or gets hurt in your driveway, you could be sued for everything you have. They planted seeds of doubt and fear that grew a little bit every day. Maybe the house was getting too much for me to handle. Maybe I was being foolish trying to maintain a 3-bedroom home by myself. Maybe I should consider other options. But the real campaign began in November 2020 when Robert showed up alone on a Wednesday afternoon with a folder full of papers. "Mom, I've been doing some research about your financial situation," he said, spreading documents across my kitchen table. "I'm worried about your future security." He'd apparently been investigating my finances without my knowledge. He knew about the second mortgage I'd taken out for Jessica's college tuition. He knew about the retirement accounts I'd liquidated for the other grandchildren. He knew exactly how much money I had in my checking and savings accounts. "Mom, you've got less than $30,000 in savings," he said, acting concerned. "Your teacher's pension is only $1,800 a month. The mortgage payments on this house are $800 a month, plus utilities, insurance, maintenance. You're barely breaking even." I felt defensive and embarrassed. "I'm managing fine, Robert. I've never missed a payment on anything." "But what happens when you need expensive medical care? What happens when you can't drive anymore and need transportation to doctor appointments? What happens when you need help with daily activities?" He pulled out more papers, printouts about long-term care costs, nursing home expenses, and Medicare limitations. "Mom, if you need skilled nursing care, it costs an average of $7,000 a month in this area. How long would your savings last?" I'd never thought about these things in such stark financial terms. Harold and I had always assumed we'd take care of each other, and that our sons would help us figure things out when the time came. Harold's sudden death had left me unprepared for the practical realities of aging alone. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. "I think you should consider selling this house while you're healthy and can make good decisions," Robert said. "The real estate market is hot right now. Houses in this neighborhood are selling for $300,000 or more. You could pay off the mortgage, have over $200,000 in cash, and move to a nice retirement community where all your needs would be taken care of." The idea horrified me. Sell the house where Harold and I had built our life together? Leave the neighborhood where I'd lived for over 40 years? Give up my independence to live in some institutional setting? "I'm not ready for that," I said firmly. "This is my home." But Robert didn't give up. Over the next few weeks, Thomas joined the campaign. They started bringing me brochures for retirement communities, articles about elderly people who'd been injured in home accidents, and statistics about home invasions targeting older adults living alone. They painted a picture of my future that was terrifying. Me falling down the stairs with no one to help. Criminals targeting my house because they knew an elderly woman lived alone. Medical emergencies with no family nearby to assist. "We're not trying to control your life, Mom," Thomas would say. "We just want you to be safe and secure. And we want you to enjoy your remaining years instead of worrying about house payments and home maintenance," Robert would add. By January 2021, they'd worn down my resistance enough to get me to agree to tour a few retirement communities. The places they showed me were nice enough, clean, safe, with activities and meal plans. But they felt like institutions, not homes. More importantly, even the most affordable ones cost $3,500 a month for a basic apartment. The nicer ones cost $5,000 or more. Even if I sold the house and invested the proceeds, my money would only last 8 to 10 years in one of those places. "What happens when the money runs out?" I asked. "Mom, you're worrying about problems that are decades away," Robert said. "You're only 68. You'll probably live in the retirement community for a few years, then qualify for Medicaid assistance if you need more intensive care later." What he was really saying was that I should spend my inheritance, the house Harold and I had worked 40 years to pay off, on a few comfortable years, and then depend on government assistance for the rest of my life. But my sons presented it as the responsible, practical choice. The pressure campaign intensified through the spring of 2021. They started visiting twice a week, always with new arguments about why I should sell the house. They brought statistics about property taxes increasing, stories about elderly neighbors who'd had expensive home repair emergencies, and warnings about what would happen if I became incapacitated and couldn't make decisions for myself. "Mom, if you have a stroke like Dad did, who's going to handle your finances?" Thomas asked during one particularly intense conversation. "Who's going to make sure your bills get paid and your affairs are in order?" That's when they first mentioned the power of attorney. "Just as a precaution," Robert explained, "you should designate someone to handle your finances if you ever become unable to do it yourself. It's just a legal formality, but it protects you from having your assets frozen if you're ever hospitalized or incapacitated." I trusted my sons. Despite their pressure about selling the house, I believed they had my best interests at heart. They were successful men with good jobs and families of their own. They didn't need my money. They were just trying to make sure I was protected. So when they brought me papers to sign in June 2021, giving them joint power of attorney over my finances in case of emergency, I signed them without reading every detail. "This just means that if you're ever unconscious in the hospital or something like that, we can pay your bills and handle necessary business," Thomas explained. "It doesn't change anything about your day-to-day control over your own money." I signed those papers on a Tuesday afternoon in my kitchen, with both my sons watching and witnessing my signature. I had no idea I'd just handed them the legal authority to steal everything I owned. And I had no idea they'd already contacted a real estate agent to get an estimate on my house's current market value. The trap was set. Now they just had to wait for the right moment to spring it. The betrayal began on a Thursday morning in August 2021, exactly 2 months after I'd signed those power of attorney papers. I was in my garden, tending to the tomato plants Harold had helped me start the spring before he died, when a car pulled into my driveway. A woman in a business suit got out, carrying a clipboard and a camera. "Mrs. Hartwell?" she called out. "I'm Janet Morrison from Century 21. I'm here to do the property assessment you requested." I stood up, confused, soil still clinging to my gardening gloves. "I'm sorry, but I didn't request any assessment." Janet looked confused too, checking her paperwork. "I have an appointment scheduled by Robert Hartwell. He said you were interested in getting a current market evaluation for your home." My stomach dropped. "Robert scheduled this without telling me?" "Oh," Janet said, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe there was a miscommunication. Should I reschedule for when you've had a chance to talk with your son?" I was angry, but I didn't want to cause a scene with this real estate agent who was just doing her job. "No, as long as you're here, you might as well take a look around. But I want to be clear, I'm not selling my house." Janet spent an hour photographing every room, measuring spaces, and taking notes about the condition of the property. She was professional and respectful, but I felt violated having a stranger cataloging my most private spaces without my permission. When she finished, she handed me a business card. "Mrs. Hartwell, based on comparable sales in your neighborhood, I'd estimate your home is worth between $310,000 and $330,000. It's a beautiful property." After she left, I called Robert immediately. "Mom, I should have mentioned it," he said when I confronted him, "but I thought it would be helpful for you to have current information about your biggest asset. Knowledge is power, right?" "Robert, I told you I'm not ready to sell this house." I know. But there's no harm in knowing what it's worth. Besides, the market is really hot right now. If you wait too long, values might drop." I hung up feeling uneasy, but I told myself he was just being thorough. Maybe it was smart to know the current value of the house, even if I had no intention of selling. That weekend, both sons came for Sunday dinner as usual. But this time, they brought their wives and a folder full of new documents. "Mom, we've been talking," Thomas began, and we think we've found the perfect solution for your housing situation. They spread brochures across my kitchen table for Mountain View Estates, a retirement community about 15 minutes from town. It wasn't one of the places we'd toured before. This one was smaller, older, and significantly less expensive. "Look at this, Mom," Susan said enthusiastically. "It's only $2,800 a month, and that includes meals, housekeeping, and transportation to medical appointments. You'd have your own apartment, but you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work anymore." I looked at the brochures. Mountain View Estates looked institutional and depressing compared to the nicer places we'd visited. The apartments were tiny, the common areas looked dated, and the recreational activities seemed limited. "This doesn't look nearly as nice as the other places we looked at," I said. "But it's much more affordable," Robert pointed out. "If you sell the house and invest the proceeds conservatively, you could live here comfortably for 15 or 20 years. Mom," Linda added gently, "we've all been talking, and we're really worried about you being alone in this big house. What if you fell and couldn't get to a phone? What if someone broke in? We'd never forgive ourselves if something happened to you." They'd prepared for this conversation carefully. They had spreadsheets showing how my finances would work at Mountain View Estates. They had testimonials from other families who'd moved elderly relatives there. They had articles about the benefits of retirement community living for widowed women. The pressure felt overwhelming. "I need time to think about this," I said. "Of course," Thomas replied. "But Mom, there's a waiting list at Mountain View. If you're interested, you need to get your name on the list soon. It doesn't commit you to anything, but it keeps your options open." Over the next 3 weeks, they visited me 5 times. Each visit included new arguments about why I should move to Mountain View Estates, new fears about what could happen if I stayed in my house, and new urgency about getting on the waiting list. By the end of August, I was exhausted from the constant pressure. They'd made me genuinely afraid of living alone, genuinely worried about my financial future, and genuinely confused about what was best for me. That's when they brought me the papers. "Mom, we've worked everything out," Robert said, arriving on a Tuesday afternoon with Thomas and a folder of documents. "We can get you into Mountain View Estates by October 1st. All you need to do is sign these papers to get the process started." I was sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where Harold and I had paid bills together for 40 years, where I'd helped my children with homework, where I'd planned my grandchildren's birthday parties. "What exactly am I signing?" I asked. "Just paperwork to formalize the sale of the house and your admission to Mountain View," Thomas explained. "We're using the power of attorney you gave us to handle all the complex legal details, so you don't have to worry about anything. If you're feeling the pain of family betrayal with me right now, show your support, hit that like button, comment if you've been through something similar, and subscribe because we strong women need to stick together through the darkest moments." I hesitated, looking at the stack of papers. There were so many documents, with legal language I didn't understand. Real estate contracts, admission agreements, financial forms. "Can I have my attorney look at these first?" I asked. "Mom, that's just going to slow everything down and cost you money," Robert said. "We've already had our lawyer review everything. These are all standard documents." "Besides," Thomas added, "you trust us, right? We're your sons. We've spent months researching the best options for you. We would never do anything that wasn't in your best interests." I looked at my 2 sons, both of whom I'd raised to be honorable men, both of whom had successful careers and families of their own, both of whom had been telling me for months that they just wanted me to be safe and secure. "Just sign here, Mom," Robert said, pointing to signature lines he'd marked with yellow sticky notes. "It's for your own good." Those words, "it's for your own good," would haunt me for months. I signed every paper they put in front of me. I had no idea I'd just authorized them to sell my house without my presence at the closing. I had no idea the admission agreement for Mountain View Estates was actually a commitment to pay $2,800 a month whether I lived there or not. I had no idea they'd structured everything so that the proceeds from my house would go directly into accounts they controlled. I had no idea that in 30 minutes of signing papers, I'd lost everything Harold and I had worked 46 years to build. but I was about to find out. 3 weeks after signing those papers, I was living in apartment 12B at Mountain View Estates, and I knew I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The cozy one-bedroom apartment from the brochures was actually a cramped studio with a Murphy bed, a tiny kitchenette, and a bathroom so small I could barely turn around in it. The gourmet meals were institutional cafeteria food served on plastic trays. The active social environment consisted of bingo games and television watching in a common room that smelled like disinfectant and despair. But the worst part wasn't the living conditions. It was the realization that I'd been tricked. On my third day at Mountain View, I asked Robert about accessing money from the house sale to buy some personal items for my apartment. "Mom, remember we talked about this," he said patiently. "We're managing the money from the house sale to make sure it lasts as long as possible. We've set up automatic payments for your monthly fees here, and we'll give you a small allowance for personal expenses." "An allowance?" I repeated. "Robert, that's my money. I need to be able to access my own funds." "Mom, you signed papers giving us authority to manage your finances for your own protection. We're investing the money conservatively so it will last for your entire stay here." That's when I realized what had really happened. My sons hadn't helped me make a smart financial decision. They'd engineered a way to control my money while warehousing me in the cheapest possible facility. I asked to see financial statements showing how the money from my house was being invested. Robert said he'd get that information together, but never produced any documents. I asked about moving to a nicer retirement community if I was willing to pay higher monthly fees. Thomas said that wouldn't be financially responsible given my limited resources. When I suggested that maybe I'd made a mistake and wanted to move back to independent living, both sons became very concerned about my mental state and whether I was competent to make such major decisions. I was trapped. Mountain View Estates had a policy that residents who wanted to leave had to give 90 days' notice and forfeit their entrance fees. I'd signed papers committing to a minimum 1-year stay. My house was sold, my money was controlled by my sons, and I was living in what amounted to a low-security prison. But I wasn't completely helpless. During my career as a teacher, I'd worked with many families dealing with custody disputes, financial abuse, and legal problems. I knew that elderly financial abuse was a serious crime, and I knew there were resources available to help victims. On a Thursday morning in November 2021, I told the staff at Mountain View that I was going to the library for their weekly book club. Instead, I took the community shuttle bus downtown to the offices of Carolina Elder Law. I'd found their name in the phone book and called from the payphone in Mountain View's lobby, explaining that I needed help with a family financial matter but couldn't discuss details over the phone. The receptionist scheduled me an appointment with Margaret Chen, an attorney who specialized in elder abuse cases. Margaret Chen was a woman about my daughter-in-law's age, but she had the sharp, focused demeanor of someone who'd seen every possible way that family members could exploit elderly relatives. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said after I'd told her my story, "I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need you to answer honestly. Do you believe your sons deliberately deceived you about the nature of the documents you signed?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Do you believe they've used their power of attorney to benefit themselves rather than to protect your interests?" "Yes." "Do you want them to continue controlling your finances and living situation?" "Absolutely not." Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Hartwell, what your sons have done is called financial elder abuse, and it's a felony in North Carolina. We can fight this, but I need to warn you, it's going to be ugly. They're going to claim you're mentally incompetent, that you're confused about what you agreed to, and that they were just trying to protect you." "I understand," I said. "But I can't live like this. They've stolen my independence and my home." "There's something else you should know," Margaret continued. "When we challenge their power of attorney and their handling of your house sale, they're going to be very angry. Family relationships that are already damaged may be destroyed completely." I thought about my 4 grandchildren, who hadn't visited me once since I'd moved to Mountain View. I thought about my sons, who came by twice a week to check on me like I was a pet they'd boarded at a kennel. I thought about the 46 years of memories locked away in a house that strangers now owned. "Ms. Chen," I said, "those relationships were destroyed the day they decided to lie to me and steal my home. I just didn't know it yet." Margaret smiled grimly. "Then let's get your life back." The first step was getting my finances audited. Margaret filed emergency motions to freeze all accounts connected to my house sale and to require my sons to provide detailed accounting of every penny they'd spent or invested on my behalf. What we discovered was worse than I'd imagined. The house had sold for $315,000 in September 2021. After paying off my remaining mortgage of $47,000, the net proceeds should have been $268,000. But Robert and Thomas had deducted $8,000 in management fees for handling the sale. They'd paid themselves $12,000 for moving and transition services. They'd spent $15,000 on furniture and appliances for their own homes, claiming these were items Mom wanted us to have. Most shocking of all, they'd used $45,000 of my money as down payments on rental properties they were buying as investments for Mom's future income. Of the $268,000 that should have been mine, only $188,000 remained in accounts I could access. My sons had stolen $80,000 in just 2 months. Margaret filed criminal charges against both of them for financial elder abuse, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. She also filed civil lawsuits to recover the money they'd stolen and to dissolve the power of attorney agreement. When the charges were filed in December 2021, both of my sons were arrested at their workplaces. Their mugshots appeared in the local newspaper under the headline, "Local Men Charged in Elder Abuse Case." The phone calls started immediately. "Mom, how could you do this to us?" Robert screamed at me over the phone from the county jail. "We were trying to help you, and you're treating us like criminals." "We've got families to think about," Thomas said during his call. "Do you know what this is doing to our careers? To our reputations in the community?" "You should have thought about that before you stole from me," I replied and hung up. But the legal battles were just beginning, and I was about to discover that my sons had hidden even more secrets from me. The criminal trial of my own sons began in March 2022, 6 months after I'd moved into that horrible apartment at Mountain View Estates. Sitting in a courthouse watching Robert and Thomas in defendants' chairs was surreal. These were the babies I'd rocked to sleep, the little boys I'd bandaged when they fell off their bicycles, the young men I'd been so proud of when they graduated college. Now they were felons. Margaret Chen had prepared me for how ugly the trial would get, but nothing could have prepared me for hearing my own children testify that I was a confused, mentally declining old woman who didn't understand my own financial decisions. "Your Honor," Robert's attorney argued, "my client was trying to protect his elderly mother from making poor choices that would have left her destitute. Mrs. Hartwell had already spent $180,000 of her retirement savings on her grandchildren's education. She was clearly not thinking rationally about money." Thomas's lawyer was even worse. Mrs. Hartwell was showing signs of memory loss and confusion after her husband's death. My client stepped in to provide financial guidance because he was genuinely worried about her welfare. They painted me as a senile widow who couldn't be trusted with her own affairs, a woman who needed her wise sons to save her from herself. But Margaret had done her homework. She called Dr. Patricia Williams, my family physician, who testified that I'd had comprehensive cognitive testing done just 6 months before signing those papers, and my mental acuity was completely normal for my age. She called Janet Morrison, the real estate agent, who testified that Robert had contacted her about selling my house without my knowledge, and that I'd seemed surprised and upset when she arrived for the property assessment. She called 3 residents of Mountain View Estates who testified that I'd repeatedly told them I'd been tricked into moving there and wanted to leave. Most damaging of all, she called Harold's life insurance company. That's when I learned the biggest secret my sons had been keeping from me. Harold had been a veteran of the Vietnam War, which entitled him to a life insurance policy through the Veterans Administration. But when he died in February 2020, there had been complications with the claim because of questions about whether his death was related to Agent Orange exposure during his military service. The insurance company had been investigating the claim for 2 years, and the policy was worth $850,000. My sons had known about the policy all along. They'd been handling correspondence with the VA and the insurance company, using the power of attorney I'd given them. But they'd never told me the claim was being processed. In fact, the insurance company had approved the claim in January 2022, just 3 months after my sons were arrested. If I hadn't filed charges against them, they would have collected nearly $1 million on my behalf, and I never would have known about it. Margaret subpoenaed all the insurance records, and the evidence was devastating. Robert and Thomas had been planning to collect the life insurance money, invest it in their rental property business, and tell me the claim had been denied. They weren't just thieves. They were sophisticated financial criminals who'd planned to steal over $1 million from their own mother. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Robert was convicted of financial elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay $150,000 in restitution. Thomas was convicted of the same charges plus perjury for lying under oath about his knowledge of the insurance policy. He got 4 years in prison and $200,000 in restitution. But the criminal convictions were just the beginning of their problems. The North Carolina State Bar launched ethics investigations into their business practices. Robert lost his insurance license, and Thomas was fired from his banking job. Their wives filed for divorce within weeks of the sentencing, taking their children and half of their assets. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about the case, and the community response was swift and brutal. Both men had been involved in their churches, their children's schools, and local business organizations. All of those connections evaporated overnight. Susan and Linda, my former daughters-in-law, brought the grandchildren to see me once during the trial. Madison, Mason, Jessica, and Brandon sat uncomfortably in Mountain View's visiting room while their mothers tried to explain why their fathers were in jail. "Grandma Connie," Jessica said hesitantly, "we had no idea what Dad and Uncle Robert were doing to you. We're really sorry." "We know you paid for our college," Madison added. "We should have thanked you properly, and we should have stayed in touch." I looked at these 4 young adults, all successful in their careers, all beneficiaries of my $180,000 sacrifice, and realized they were genuinely remorseful. "I forgive you," I told them, "but your fathers made choices that have consequences. I can't pretend those choices didn't happen just because we're family." The grandchildren visited me a few more times over the next year, but the relationships were awkward and strained. How do you rebuild connections with people when their fathers are in prison for stealing from you? Meanwhile, Margaret was working on getting my money back and my living situation resolved. The civil lawsuits against Robert and Thomas resulted in full recovery of the $80,000 they'd stolen, plus punitive damages of another $120,000. Combined with the remaining proceeds from my house sale and the life insurance settlement, I suddenly had access to over $1.2 million. More importantly, Margaret successfully argued that the entire Mountain View Estates contract was fraudulent because I'd signed it based on false information about my financial situation. The facility was required to refund my entrance fees and release me from the residency agreement. By June 2022, I was free to leave Mountain View and rebuild my life however I chose. I was 73 years old, had over $1 million in the bank, and faced a question I'd never expected to confront. What do you do when you discover your entire family was built on lies, but you still have years of life ahead of you? The answer came from an unexpected source. During my months at Mountain View, I'd become friends with 3 other women who were also living there against their will. Eleanor had been placed there by a nephew who'd convinced her to sell her farm so he could pay off gambling debts. Patricia had been manipulated by her daughter into signing over her pension checks. Rose had been abandoned there by her son after she'd given him money to start a business that failed. All 4 of us had been victims of financial elder abuse by our own families. "Connie," Eleanor said during one of our evening conversations. "When you get out of this place, what are you going to do?" I'd been thinking about that question for weeks. I could buy a small house and live quietly for my remaining years. I could travel and see places Harold and I had always planned to visit. I could move to a nice retirement community where I'd be genuinely safe and cared for. But none of those options felt like enough. "I think," I said slowly, "I want to make sure other women don't go through what we've been through." That conversation was the beginning of the most important decision I'd ever make. In August 2022, I bought a magnificent property in the Blue Ridge Mountains, 30 minutes outside Asheville. The estate had belonged to a wealthy textile family for 3 generations, but the last owner had died without heirs, and the property had been on the market for 2 years. 15 acres of pristine mountain land, a main house with 8 bedrooms and 6 bathrooms, a guest cottage, and the most spectacular views of the Blue Ridge Mountains you've ever seen. The asking price was $750,000, which seemed like a fortune to a retired teacher who'd been living on a pension just 2 years earlier. But I'd learned something important during my legal battles with Robert and Thomas. Money is just a tool, and the question isn't how much you have, but what you do with it. I named the property Mountain View Haven, and I had a very specific vision for what it would become. During my months at Mountain View Estates, I'd learned that financial elder abuse affects nearly 1 in 10 Americans over age 60. Most victims are women who've spent their lives trusting family members who ultimately betray that trust. Most cases never result in criminal charges because the victims are too ashamed, too frightened, or too isolated to fight back. I wanted to create a place where women like Eleanor, Patricia, Rose, and myself could rebuild their lives with dignity, safety, and genuine support. Mountain View Haven wouldn't be a traditional retirement community with monthly fees and institutional rules. It would be a true home where women who'd been financially abused by their families could live independently while supporting each other through the healing process. The first residents moved in during October 2022, just 1 year after I'd been tricked into signing those papers that nearly destroyed my life. Eleanor came first, bringing her 2 elderly cats and her collection of quilts she'd made over 50 years of farming. Her nephew had stolen $300,000 from the sale of her family farm, but she'd recovered most of it through legal action similar to mine. Patricia arrived next, a former nurse whose daughter had forged her signature on checks for 3 years before being caught. Patricia brought her medical knowledge and her incredible skill at vegetable gardening. Rose moved in just before Thanksgiving, still recovering from the emotional trauma of discovering that her son had used her retirement savings to fund a failed restaurant, then abandoned her at Mountain View when she could no longer afford to support his lifestyle. Within 6 months, we had 8 residents ranging in age from 69 to 82. Each woman had her own bedroom and bathroom in the main house, with common areas for cooking, dining, and socializing. The guest cottage became a library and craft room where residents could pursue hobbies and interests they'd abandoned during years of caring for ungrateful family members. But Mountain View Haven was more than just housing. It was a supportive community designed specifically for women recovering from family financial abuse. We brought in counselors who specialized in elder abuse trauma. We organized legal clinics where attorneys provided free advice about estate planning and asset protection. We hosted support groups where women could share their experiences without judgment or shame. Most importantly, we created a family structure based on choice rather than obligation, respect rather than control, and genuine care rather than financial exploitation. Every morning, we gathered in the big kitchen for coffee and breakfast. Unlike the institutional cafeteria at Mountain View, our kitchen was warm and welcoming, with windows overlooking the mountains and a huge table where everyone could sit together. We took turns cooking, sharing recipes and stories from our past lives. Eleanor taught us to make biscuits from scratch, using her grandmother's recipe. Patricia grew herbs and vegetables in our garden that added fresh flavors to every meal. Rose, who'd worked as a baker before marriage, made birthday cakes that were works of art. We celebrated holidays together, traveled on group trips to places like Biltmore Estate and the Great Smoky Mountains, and supported each other through medical appointments and family crises. When Eleanor had pneumonia in the winter of 2023, Patricia and I took shifts sitting with her in the hospital because her nephew, the one who'd stolen her farm money, never bothered to visit. When Rose's son finally called asking for money to start another business venture, we all supported her decision to hang up on him. We also started reaching out to help other women in similar situations. Through partnerships with local social services and elder law attorneys, we developed a network that could identify financial abuse cases early and connect victims with resources for legal help, counseling, and safe housing. I used part of Harold's life insurance money to establish the Hartwell Foundation for Elder Financial Protection, which provided grants to women who couldn't afford attorneys to fight financial abuse cases. We lobbied the state legislature to strengthen penalties for elder financial abuse and to create better reporting systems for suspicious financial activity involving elderly adults. Most satisfying of all, we became a resource for prosecutors handling elder abuse cases. When adult children tried to claim their elderly parents were mentally incompetent or confused about financial decisions, attorneys could point to Mountain View Haven as evidence that alleged victims were actually sharp, capable women who'd been deliberately deceived. By 2024, our success stories were being covered in newspapers and magazines throughout North Carolina. We'd helped over 200 women recover stolen assets and regain control of their financial lives. We'd seen dozens of adult children prosecuted for financial elder abuse. We'd changed state laws to better protect elderly adults from family financial exploitation. But the most important change was in how I thought about family. The 8 women who lived at Mountain View Haven had become my real family. We shared daily joys and sorrows, supported each other through illness and grief, and celebrated each other's achievements and milestones. When Patricia's granddaughter graduated from college, using money Patricia had saved before her daughter stole from her, all of us attended the ceremony and cheered louder than anyone else in the auditorium. When Eleanor received a letter from a distant cousin who'd heard about her story and wanted to reconnect with family members who weren't criminals, we all helped her decide whether to trust this new relationship. When Rose's health started declining in 2024, requiring more medical care, we converted the guest cottage into a comfortable apartment where she could have privacy while still being close to help when needed. We were what family should be. People who showed up for each other consistently, who protected each other's interests rather than exploiting them, and who measured love through actions rather than words. In March 2024, I received a letter from Robert, who was scheduled to be released from prison in 6 months. He wanted to rebuild our relationship and asked if he could visit Mountain View Haven when he got out. I showed the letter to Eleanor, Patricia, and Rose, and we discussed it over coffee in our kitchen overlooking the mountains. "What do you want to do?" Eleanor asked. I said, "I want to make sure he understands exactly what he destroyed and exactly what I built in its place." That conversation led to the most important decision I'd made since buying the property. Robert was released from prison in September 2024, after serving 2.5 years of his 3-year sentence. Thomas wouldn't be eligible for parole until the following year. The first letter from Robert arrived 2 weeks after his release. He wanted to meet with me to apologize properly and to discuss our family's future. He'd found work as a night security guard, one of the few jobs available to convicted felons, and was living in a studio apartment across town. I agreed to meet with him, but I chose the location carefully. We met in the main living room at Mountain View Haven on a Tuesday afternoon in October. Eleanor, Patricia, and Rose were all present, not as observers, but as my chosen family, who deserved to meet the man who'd nearly destroyed my life. Robert looked older than his 54 years. Prison had aged him, but more than that, he carried himself like a man who'd lost everything he'd thought defined him: his career, his marriage, his reputation, his children's respect. "Mom," he began, "I want you to know how sorry I am for what I did to you. I know you probably can't forgive me, but I need you to understand that I never meant to hurt you." I let him talk for 20 minutes. He explained how financial pressures had led him to make poor decisions. He talked about how much he'd learned in prison about treating people with respect. He promised that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make amends for the pain he'd caused. When he finished, I introduced him to Eleanor, Patricia, and Rose. "Robert," I said, "these women are my family now. Eleanor is the sister I never had, who brings wisdom and humor to every conversation. Patricia is the daughter I wish I'd raised, who uses her medical knowledge to take care of all of us. Rose is the friend who understands exactly what it feels like to be betrayed by your own child." Robert looked confused. "Mom, I don't understand. I'm your family. I know I made mistakes, but blood is thicker than water." "No, Robert," I said firmly. "Blood is just biology. Family is about who shows up when you need them, who protects you when you're vulnerable, and who celebrates your joys without trying to take credit for them." I gestured around the beautiful living room where we were sitting, with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, its comfortable furniture arranged for conversation, its walls decorated with artwork created by residents who'd rediscovered their creativity after escaping financial abuse. "You see this place? You see these women? This is what I built with the life insurance money you tried to steal from me. This is what happened when I stopped waiting for my biological family to value me and started creating a chosen family based on mutual respect." Robert's face showed he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what he'd lost. "We provide sanctuary for women who've been financially abused by their own children, grandchildren, and other relatives," I continued. "We've helped over 200 women recover stolen money and rebuild their lives. We've changed state laws to better protect elderly adults from family financial exploitation." I pulled out a thick folder of newspaper clippings, legal documents, and letters from women we'd helped. "Robert, your decision to steal from me didn't just hurt me. It opened my eyes to a problem I'd never known existed. Your betrayal became the foundation for something that's made a real difference in the world." Eleanor leaned forward in her chair. "Young man, your mother has saved more lives in the past 3 years than most people save in a lifetime. Women who were suicidal from family betrayal now have hope. Women who thought they'd die alone and forgotten now have real family who loves them." Patricia nodded. "Connie didn't just survive what you did to her. She transformed it into purpose." Rose, the quietest of our group, spoke last. "My son stole from me too. But I never had the courage to fight back the way your mother did. She's the strongest woman I've ever known." Robert sat quietly for several minutes, absorbing what he was hearing. Finally, he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. "Mom, can you ever forgive me?" I'd been preparing for that question for months, and I knew exactly how to answer it. "Robert, I forgave you for my own peace of mind, not for your benefit. Carrying anger and resentment would have poisoned the beautiful life I've built here. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean pretending that trust can be rebuilt just because you're sorry." I stood up and walked to the window overlooking our garden, where several residents were harvesting vegetables for dinner. "You asked about our family's future," I continued. "Here's what that looks like. You're my biological son, and I don't wish you any harm. I hope you build a good life for yourself with honest work and healthy relationships. But you're not my family in any meaningful sense anymore." I turned back to face him. "These women are my family. The women who've found safety and healing here are my legacy. The laws we've helped change to protect elderly adults are my contribution to the world." Robert looked around the room at Eleanor, Patricia, and Rose, who were watching him with expressions that were kind but firm. "What about Thomas?" he asked. "What happens when he gets out of prison?" "Thomas will receive the same message you're receiving today," I replied. "He's welcome to build a good life for himself, but he's not welcome to pretend we're family after what he chose to do." I walked over to my desk and pulled out an envelope with Robert's name on it. "This is my final gift to you," I said, handing it to him. "It's a check for $5,000, enough to help you get established in an honest life. It's also a letter explaining that this is the last financial assistance you'll ever receive from me, and the last communication we'll have unless there's a genuine emergency. Robert opened the envelope and read the letter, which I'd written with Margaret Chen's help to ensure it was legally clear and emotionally final. "I don't understand," he said. "Mom, I'm your son. Doesn't that mean anything?" If this story of transformation and chosen family touched your heart, like this video right now, tell me in the comments what gave you the strength to rebuild after betrayal, and subscribe to Grandma's Legacy, because every grandmother deserves to have her voice heard and her story valued. "Robert," I said gently, "being my son was a privilege that came with responsibilities. You had the responsibility to protect me when I was vulnerable, to honor the sacrifices I made for you and your children, and to treat me with the respect I'd earned through 71 years of living with integrity." I sat back down across from him. "You chose to exploit my trust instead of honoring it. You chose to steal from me instead of protecting me. You chose to warehouse me in an awful facility instead of ensuring I had a dignified place to live." Eleanor reached over and took my hand in a gesture of support. "Those choices have consequences," I continued. "The consequence is that you lost the privilege of being my family. You'll always be the person I gave birth to and raised, but you're not my son in any way that matters." Robert left that afternoon with his check and his letter, and I haven't seen or heard from him since. I don't know if he's built a good life for himself, and I don't spend time wondering about it. What I do know is that every morning when I wake up in my beautiful bedroom at Mountain View Haven, I'm surrounded by the sounds of women who chose to love me and whom I chose to love in return. I know that every evening when we gather for dinner in our dining room, sharing stories and laughter, I'm experiencing the kind of family connection I spent 71 years thinking was supposed to come automatically from blood relations. I know that every month, when we welcome a new resident who's been financially abused by her own family, we're proving that it's never too late to find real love and genuine security. The 8 women who live here now, some have moved on to independent living, others have joined us, represent every background, every career, every family structure. We have former teachers, nurses, business owners, and homemakers. We have women who were married 50 years and women who were single mothers. We have women whose children stole hundreds of thousands of dollars and women whose families abandoned them for much smaller amounts. What unites us isn't our past pain. It's our present commitment to treating each other with the dignity, respect, and genuine care that families should provide, but often don't. When people ask me if I regret how things turned out with Robert and Thomas, I tell them honestly, I regret that I raised sons who could choose to steal from their own mother, but I don't regret discovering who they really were before I wasted more years trusting them. When people ask if I miss having my real family around, I tell them to look around Mountain View Haven and see what real family actually looks like. Real family doesn't manipulate you into signing papers for your own good. Real family doesn't steal your money while claiming to protect you. Real family doesn't warehouse you in substandard housing while pocketing the profits from your life's work. Real family shows up when you're sick. Real family celebrates your achievements without trying to take credit. Real family protects your interests even when it's inconvenient for them. Real family chooses to love you every day, not because they have to, but because they want to. I spent 71 years believing that family was something you inherited. Now I know that the best families are something you create. At 76 years old, living in a house full of women who have become my chosen sisters, daughters, and friends, I can honestly say these have been the happiest years of my life. Robert and Thomas gave me biology. Eleanor, Patricia, Rose, and all the women who found healing at Mountain View Haven gave me family. The difference is everything. And to any woman listening to this story who's been betrayed by her own children, grandchildren, or other relatives who were supposed to protect her, it's not too late to find your real family. It's not too late to rebuild your life with dignity and purpose. It's not too late to discover that some of the best relationships are built on choice rather than chance. Your blood relatives had their opportunity to prove they were worthy of your love and trust. If they failed that test, that's their loss, not yours. The family you deserve is out there waiting for you. You just have to be brave enough to recognize them when they appear, and strong enough to choose them over the people who chose not to choose you. Trust me on this. At 76 years old, surrounded by chosen family who starts every day grateful we found each other, I can promise you, the love you build is always stronger than the love you inherit. And it's never, ever too late to start building.